The year is 1944. The location is a muddy, rain-soaked field in northern France, just a few miles behind the advancing front lines. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, stinging scent of diesel fumes. On one side of a hastily erected barbed wire fence sits a group of men in grey wool uniforms. They are dirty, exhausted, and defeated. These are soldiers of the Wehrmacht, men who once marched across Europe with an air of invincibility. Now they are prisoners of war, huddled together against the cold, watching their captors. Among them is a major from the Luftwaffe, a man who has spent his entire career believing in the superiority of German engineering. He knows how to build an airbase. He knows it because he has seen it done in the fatherland. It is a process of years. You need surveys. You need architects. You need to lay deep concrete foundations that cure over weeks. You need brick and mortar for the hangars, steel reinforced by master craftsmen. To the German mind, an airbase is a fortress, a permanent scar on the landscape, designed to last 1,000 years, just like the Reich itself was supposed to. He looks out at the field across from the holding pen. It is nothing but a swamp. It is an uneven, cratered mess of mud and torn-up vegetation, destroyed by retreating artillery and churned up by tank tracks. In his professional opinion, that field is useless. It would take 6 months to drain the water alone, another 6 months to level it. Maybe in 2 years you could land a plane there. He watches the Americans gathering on the edge of that swamp and he shakes his head. He turns to the young corporal beside him and mutters that the Americans are fools if they think they can operate aircraft from this bog. But what that major is about to witness over the next 240 hours will shatter his reality more effectively than any bomb. He is about to watch the United States Army Corps of Engineers do the impossible. He is about to see them take a piece of unusable earth and turn it into a fully operational forward airfield in less time than it takes a German bureaucrat to file the paperwork for a single load of cement. This is the story of how speed, logistics, and brute industrial force defeated the meticulously crafted war machine of old Europe. This is the story of the 10-day miracle that broke the spirit of the German army. To understand why this moment in the mud was so significant, we had to pull back and look at the bigger picture of the war at this stage. By late 1944, the German military was suffering from a fatal misconception about their enemy. For years, German propaganda had painted the Americans as soft. They were viewed as undisciplined, disorganized cowboys who lacked the martial tradition of the Prussians. The German high command believed that while the Americans had money and factories, they lacked the discipline to wage a serious war. They were wrong. They failed to understand that the American approach to war wasn't about martial tradition. It was about industrial application. It was about treating a battle not as a chess match, but as an engineering project. Consider the state of the Luftwaffe at this time. Germany had some of the best aircraft designs in the world. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter was light years ahead of anything the Allies had. But a jet fighter is useless if it doesn't have a runway. As the Allies bombed German airfields into oblivion, the Luftwaffe was forced to hide their planes in forests and on the sides of the Autobahn. They were paralyzed. When they did try to build new runways, they fell back on their old habits over engineering. They tried to build perfect runways in the middle of a war zone. They wasted precious time and resources trying to maintain standards that didn't matter when the bombs were falling. The Americans, on the other hand, had a completely different philosophy. It was a philosophy born in the automotive factories of Detroit and the skyscraper construction sites of New York. It was the philosophy of good enough, and right now, they didn't need a runway that would last for a century. They needed a runway that would last for a month, and they needed it yesterday. This philosophical clash was invisible to the men on the ground until moments like this one in the French countryside. The German prisoners watching from behind the wire were about to get a masterclass in this new kind of warfare. They weren't watching soldiers in the traditional sense. They were watching a construction crew that happened to be wearing green uniforms. As the sun began to set on that first evening, the German major watched the first wave of American equipment roll in. And this is where the fear started to creep in. It wasn't tanks, it wasn't artillery, it was bulldozers, dozens of them. Giant, hulking yellow and olive drab beasts with steel blades that looked like they could push a mountain aside. Behind them came the graders, the steamrollers, and the dump trucks. To a modern viewer, this sounds mundane. We see construction equipment every day, but you have to put yourself in the boots of a 1940s German soldier. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on horses for logistics throughout the entire war. Yes, they had tanks and trucks, but the vast majority of their supplies were pulled by animals. They built defenses with hand shovels and manual labor. The idea of mechanizing the dirt-moving process on this scale was alien to them. The noise was the first thing that hit them. The low, rumbling growl of diesel engines starting up in unison. It wasn't the sharp crack of rifle fire. It was the deep, vibrating thrum of industry. The ground shook. The German major watched as an American officer, likely a captain in the engineer, stood on the hood of a jeep, shouting orders over the roar of the engines. There was no hesitation. There was no long consultation with blueprints. These men knew exactly what they were doing. The plan was audacious. They weren't just going to patch up the field, they were going to erase it and build a new one on top. The target was to create a runway long enough and strong enough to handle P-40s, Thunderbolts heavy, fully loaded fighter bombers that weighed over 7 tons. Landing a 7-ton aircraft on soft mud is a suicide mission. The wheels sink, the plane flips, and the pilot dies. To land a P-47, you need a surface almost as hard as concrete, and you need a mile of it. As night fell, the Germans expected the work to stop. That was the civilized way. You work during the day, you rest at night. But the Americans didn't stop. Giant floodlights snapped on, bathing the muddy field in a stark, artificial daylight. The roar of the engines didn't let up. If anything, it got louder. The Americans were working shifts. As one driver climbed down, exhausted and covered in grease, another climbed up to take his place. The machine never stopped. The bulldozer never slept. This relentless pace was a psychological weapon. Imagine trying to sleep in a wet trench while your enemy is working 24 hours a day to build a platform to kill you. It sends a message: we have more fuel than you, we have more machines than you, we have more men than you, and we are never ever going to stop coming. By the morning of the second day, the landscape had already changed. The trees that lined the edge of the field were gone, ripped out by the roots by chains attached to tractors. The cratered surface of the mud was disappearing under the blades of the bulldozers. They were pushing thousands of tons of earth, filling in the holes, shaving off the high point. It was a ballet of heavy machinery. To the German major, it looked chaotic. Trucks were weaving in and out, mud was flying, men were shouting. But it was a controlled chaos. Every movement had a purpose. The Germans were witnessing the deployment of a specific American invention that changed the war just as much as the atomic bomb or the proximity fuse. It was called pierced steel planking, or Marston Matting. We will get into the details of this incredible technology later, but for now, imagine the confusion of the German soldiers as they saw flatbed trucks arriving carrying thousands of weird, perforated steel sheets. They looked like giant cheese graters. They were heavy, awkward, and seemed to have no obvious purpose to the uninitiated. The major watched them unload these stacks of metal. He tried to calculate the weight. The logistics required just to get that steel to the front lines were staggering. Germany was struggling to get fuel to its tanks, yet the Americans had enough transport capacity to ship millions of tons of steel mats across the Atlantic, offload them at the captured ports, and truck them all the way here just for a temporary field. This is where the realization of defeat starts to set in. It's not when you lose a battle. It's when you realize the enemy is playing a game you can't even afford to buy the pieces for. The German officer realized that his country was fighting a war of scarcity, counting every bullet and every drop of gasoline. The Americans were fighting a war of abundance. They wasted nothing, but they spared nothing. As day 3 dawned, the drainage ditches were already dug. This was the part the major had said would take 6 months. The Americans did it in 48 hours, with trenching machines that ate through the soil like a hot knife through butter. The water was draining away, the foundation was drying out. The impossible swamp was becoming a flat, brown scar on the green French countryside. But the real shock was the gravel. To build a base, you need rock. Crushed rock to stabilize the mud. Usually you have to find a quarry, blast the rock, crush it, and transport it. It takes time. The Americans didn't have time, so they improvised. They found the ruins of bombed-out buildings in a nearby village. They used the rubble of the war itself. They crushed the brick and stone of destroyed houses and poured it into the mud. It was a poetic, brutal efficiency. They were using the destruction caused by the war to build the infrastructure to end it. The German POWs watched the trucks dumping this rubble. They watched the steamrollers packing it down. The ground was becoming solid. The vibration of the heavy rollers could be felt through the soles of their boots. It was a steady, rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a giant. By the 4th day, the skepticism in the holding pen had turned to a quiet, terrified awe. The joking had stopped. The major wasn't shaking his head anymore. He was standing at the wire, gripping the barbs, his eyes wide. He was watching the future of warfare, and he knew there was no place in it for the old ways. What he didn't know was that the hardest part was yet to come. The weather was turning. The sky was bruising purple and black, threatening a torrential downpour that could undo everything the Americans had done. If the heavy rains came before the steel matting was laid, the field would turn back into a soup, and the heavy equipment would sink. The timeline was tight. The American commander knew it. The pace accelerated. The engine screamed louder. This brings us to the crucial element of human endurance. We talk about machines, but machines don't run themselves. The men operating them were fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and a desperate desire to go home. They knew that every airfield they built moved the bomber line closer to Berlin. Every mile they advanced was a mile closer to the end of the war. They worked with a ferocity that the Germans hadn't expected from a soft, democratic army. In the background of this construction site, the war was still raging. You could hear the distant thud of artillery. Sometimes, a flight of Allied planes would roar overhead, returning from a mission low on fuel, some trailing smoke. They needed this field. This wasn't a theoretical exercise. Lives depended on this mud becoming a runway. If a pilot couldn't make it back to the rear bases in England, this patch of dirt was his only hope. The stakes were incredibly high, and the German prisoners, in a strange way, became invested in the spectacle. It's human nature to be captivated by a monumental effort. They were enemies, yes, but they were also soldiers and engineers. They couldn't help but admire the sheer competence on display. It was like watching a magician perform a trick that you know is impossible, but you see it happening right in front of your eyes. As the first drops of rain began to fall on the evening of the fourth day, attention settled over the camp. The Americans looked up at the sky, wiping grease from their faces. The German major looked up too. If the storm broke now, the Americans would fail. The mud would win. Nature would prove that you cannot rush engineering. But the Americans didn't slow down. They didn't take cover. They doubled their efforts. They brought in more lights. They brought in tarps. They started laying the foundation for the steel mats in the pouring rain, cursing the mud, slipping and sliding, but never stopping. This is the end of the beginning. The stage is set. The swamp has been tamed, but not conquered. The materials are on site. The enemy is watching. The clock is ticking. The first 90 to 6 hours have been a display of brute force, but the next phase requires precision. It requires the laying of the steel carpet that will carry the weight of the war. The German major is about to see the speed of the assembly line brought to the battlefield. He is about to see how a runway is stitched together like a quilt. And he is about to realize that the 10-day deadline wasn't a goal. It was a promise. The rain that had threatened to drown the project was coming down in sheets now. It turned the dust of the previous days into a slick, grey paste. In any other army, on any other front, work would have ground to a halt. You cannot pour concrete in a deluge. You cannot level mud when it's turning into a river. The German major, huddled in his greatcoat, watched with a grim satisfaction. He believed the American momentum had finally broken against the reality of European weather. But he was wrong. He was about to witness the deployment of the secret weapon that defined American combat engineering. It wasn't a bomb. And it wasn't a gun. It was a steel plank, 10 feet long, 15 inches wide, weighing exactly 66 pounds. The Americans called it pierced steel planking, or PSP. The soldiers, with their grim sense of humor, called it Marston Matting, named after the town in North Carolina where it was first tested. To the German onlookers, it looked like garbage. It was just a sheet of metal with holes punched in it. It looked flimsy. It looked temporary. It looked like something a child would invent. But as the trucks backed up to the edge of the muddy strip, the brilliance of the design became apparent. The holes weren't just to save weight. They were there to provide traction for tires and, crucially, to allow the grass, vegetation to grow back through the mat, eventually locking it into the earth. The hooks on the side of each plank were designed to interlock with the next one, creating a continuous, flexible steel skin that could float on top of the mud rather than sinking into it. The installation process began, and it was hypnotic. Teams of men, stripped to their undershirts despite the cold rain, formed lines. They worked in pairs. One man grabbed one end of a plank. His partner grabbed the other. They swung it into place, clicked the bayonet, hooks into the slots of the previous row, and stomped it down. Click, stomp. Next, click, stomp. Next. It was a rhythm. It was a dance. There were no cranes, no heavy machinery for this part. It was pure, raw manpower fueled by adrenaline. A well-drilled crew could lay thousands of square feet in an hour. The German major watched, his mouth slightly open, as a steel road began to grow out of the swamp. It was unrolling like a metal carpet. This is where the psychological impact on the prisoners shifted from skepticism to a deep, sinking dread. They were watching the industrial might of Detroit being applied to the battlefield by hand. They realized that the Americans didn't just have better tanks, they had better ideas. The Germans had spent the war building airfields like cathedrals, heavy, permanent, inflexible. The Americans were building airfields like tents, light, mobile, and ready in a heartbeat. Here is an interesting fact that the German High Command struggled to comprehend. The United States produced over 800 million square feet of this steel matting during the war, enough to wrap a steel road around the equator of the Earth. It consumed so much steel that the US halted the production of civilian cars, refrigerators, and washing machines. Every ounce of metal was channeled into things like this. The German major was looking at a single airfield, but what he was really seeing was the tip of an iceberg made of steel production that Germany simply could not match. As the runway extended further into the field, a new sound joined the cacophony. It was the distinctive, metallic clank, clank, clank of the planks settling. When a truck drove over the finished section to deliver more mats to the front, the whole runway seemed to ripple like a waterbed. It bent under the weight, but it didn't break. It distributed the load across the mud. It was ugly, it was noisy, and it worked perfectly. The prisoners noticed something else, too. They noticed the waste. To a German soldier, who had been trained to reuse every scrap of material, the American approach was shocking. If a steel plank was bent or damaged during transport, the Americans didn't try to hammer it straight. They tossed it aside into a ditch and grabbed a fresh one. If a truck engine seized up, they didn't spend 3 days stripping it down. They towed it away and brought in a brand new truck. This casual disregard for material wealth was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. It signaled an enemy with endless pockets. The major turned to his fellow officers and whispered, "Look at them. They treat steel like we treat straw." It was a realization that they were fighting a hydra. You could shoot down an American plane or blow up an American truck, but it didn't matter. There was always another one right behind it, factory fresh and ready to go. By day 6, the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and cold. The runway was now 3,000 feet long. It was a shimmering silver ribbon slicing through the devastated French landscape. But a runway needs more than just a landing strip. It needs fuel dumps, ammo depots, and control towers. This brings us to another staggering feat of logistics. While the steel matting was being laid, another team of engineers was erecting the support structures. But they weren't building them from brick and mortar. They were unpacking them from crates. The Americans had prefabricated huts, the famous Quonset huts. These were half-cylinders of corrugated steel that could be bolted together in hours. The Germans watched as a fully functional operations center rose from the mud in a single afternoon. Windows, doors, electrical wiring, it all came in a box. In the German army, if you wanted a headquarters, you commandeered a local chateau or you built a bunker. The Americans just brought their own buildings with them. It was a level of preparedness that bordered on the absurd. But the speed came with risks. On the morning of the 7th day, a crisis emerged. A section of the runway, right in the middle where the planes would be touching down, began to sink. The underlying swamp was deeper than they thought. The mud was swallowing the growl foundation. The steel mats were bowing dangerously deep. If a P-47 hit that dip at 100 miles an hour, it would tear the landing gear off. Work stopped. The silence was sudden and eerie. The American commander walked out onto the steel. He jumped on the sagging section. He looked at his watch. They didn't have time to rip it all up and pour more rock. The German major watched closely. This was the moment of failure. This was where the American haste would trip them up. You cannot cheat physics. But the American solution was not to go back. It was to improvise. They brought in truckloads of burlap sacks, thousands of them. They raided a nearby bombed-out textile factory. They lifted the steel mats and stuffed the mud holes with burlap, straw, and even logs cut from the nearby forest. They created a corduroy road beneath the steel. It was crude. It was something a farmer would do to fix a driveway, but it stabilized the ground just enough. They slammed the steel mats back down, drove a steamroller over it, and moved on. The German major was appalled. It was a violation of every engineering principle he knew. It was a patch job. But as he watched a heavy fuel truck drive over the repaired section without a hitch, his appalling turned to a grudging respect. These men didn't care about the right way to do things. They only cared about the way that worked. They were problem solvers unburdened by tradition. As the project neared completion, The prisoners began to see the human side of this machine. They saw the American soldiers taking breaks. They saw them eating white bread, chocolate, and drinking coffee that smelled rich and real luxuries the German army hadn't seen in years. They saw them listening to jazz music on portable radios while they wrenched bolts. There was a looseness to the Americans that the Germans mistook for lack of discipline. The officers didn't strut. The soldiers didn't salute every time an officer walked by. They called each other by nicknames. But when the whistle blew, they moved as a single, cohesive unit. It was a democratic discipline, born of teamwork rather than fear. The major realized that the propaganda was a lie. These weren't undisciplined cowboys. They were a team of professional specialists. Every man knew his job, from the bulldozer operator to the surveyor. They didn't need an officer screaming at them to work hard. They worked hard because they wanted to win and go home. By day 9, the finishing touches were being applied. The runway was marked with white paint. A windsock was erected. The fuel bladder's giant rubber pillows filled with thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gas were filled and ready. The smell of the air changed. It no longer smelled of wet earth and diesel. It smelled of aviation fuel and anticipation. The German POWs were no longer just observers. They were the audience for the grand finale. They lined the fence, silent, waiting. They knew what was coming. They knew that all this effort, all this noise, all this steel was for one purpose. Then they heard it. It started as a low drone in the west, barely audible over the wind. Then it grew into a roar. A flight of 4 P-47 Thunderbolts appeared on the horizon, gleaming in the sun. These were the jugs, the flying tanks, that had been terrorizing German columns for months. They were heavy, brutal machines, armed with .850 caliber machine guns and racks of bombs. The lead pilot dipped his wing, circling the new airfield. He was checking it out. From the air, the steel matting looked like a silver zipper closing the wound of the war-torn earth. The German major held his breath. He knew the weight of those planes. He knew the condition of that mud. Even with the steel, it was a gamble. The first plane dropped its landing gear. It lined up with the strip. The engines throttled back, popping and banging. The heavy fighter sank toward the steel. The moment of contact is something that stays with you. When rubber meets concrete, it screeches. But when rubber meets a steel plank runway, it sings. A high-pitched, metallic zindi echoed across the valley as the tires made contact. The steel mats clattered and banged against the earth, a ripple of noise following the plane as it sped down the runway. It was loud. It was violent. The wings shook. The mud splashed up through the holes in the mats, coating the underside of the wings. But the plane held. It didn't sink. It didn't flip. It slowed down, taxied to the end, and turned around. The second plane landed. Then the third. Then the fourth. The Americans on the ground erupted in cheers. Caps were thrown in the air. Men were slapping each other on the back. It was a party. They had beaten the clock. They had beaten the weather. They had beaten the skepticism of the old world. The German major didn't cheer. He simply let go of the barbed wire fence. His hands were white from gripping it so hard. He turned to his men, his face pale and drawn. He didn't speak of the technology. He didn't speak of the tactics. He spoke of the inevitability. "We have lost," he said quietly, "not because they are better soldiers, but because they can build a bridge to hell in a weekend, while we are still arguing over the blueprints." He had seen the future of war, and it was made of stout steel and delivered by a factory line that never stopped. But the story wasn't over. The base was built, but its impact was just beginning. The Germans were about to learn that the only thing more terrifying than American construction speed was what they could do once they had a foothold. The sun was setting on the 10th day. The base was operational. And as the night fell, the ground crews began to load the bombs. The major looked at the silhouette of the Thunderbolts against the darkening sky. He knew that tomorrow those planes wouldn't be landing. They would be taking off, and they would be heading east. The true horror for the German onlookers wasn't the construction itself. It was what happened the moment the last bolt was tightened. You see, in traditional warfare, you build a fortress, you man the walls, and you wait. But this wasn't a fortress. It was a factory of destruction. And the product it manufactured was air superiority. At dawn on the 11th day, the rhythm of the site changed. The roar of the bulldozers was replaced by the high-pitched whine of inertia starters and the thunder of radial engines. The German major woke up to a sound that vibrated in his chest. He looked out at the strip he had called a useless swamp less than 2 weeks ago. It was now the busiest airport in France. The Americans didn't just fly missions, they ran a shuttle service. This was the debut of a tactic that would break the back of the Wehrmacht in the West. It was called the cab rank system. Just like taxis waiting in a line for a passenger, the P-47 Thunderbolts would take off, circle the front lines just a few miles away, wait for a radio call from a tank commander on the ground, drop their bombs on a German pillbox or a tank column, and then, and this is the crucial part, they would come right back. Because the airfield was so close to the front thanks to that 10-day miracle, the pilots didn't have to fly an hour back to England. They only had to fly 5 minutes. They could land, rearm, refuel, and be back in the air in 20 minutes. One plane, operating from this forward base, could do the work of 5 planes operating from England. The German prisoners watched this cycle with a growing sense of doom. They watched a plane land, smoke still trailing from its gun ports. A swarm of mechanics kids, really, with grease under their fingernails and cigarettes dangling from their lips, would descend on the aircraft. One team was pumping fuel. Another was hoisting 500-pound bombs under the wings. Another was feeding belts of 50 caliber ammunition into the wing bays. Yards and yards of death being coiled into the machine. There was no ceremony. There was no marching. It was a pit stop. It was the efficiency of an Indianapolis race crew applied to the business of killing. The German major watched a pilot climb out of his cockpit, grab a sandwich from a Red Cross jeep, eat it while leaning against the landing gear, and then climb right back in to go kill more of the major's comrades. That casualness was the most insulting part. To the Germans, war was a high, tragic calling. To these Americans, it looked like a day job. They were punching the clock. By the afternoon, the impact of this single airfield was being felt across the entire sector. German radio chatter, which the prisoners could sometimes overhear from the guard posts, was frantic. They were screaming about jabos, the German slang for fighter bombers that seemed to be everywhere at once. Supply columns were being decimated. Tanks couldn't move out of the tree lines. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen because their bases were too far away. While the Americans were operating from the majestic mud right next door, the major stood by the fence, watching the sun glint off the spinning propellers. He realized then that the war was over. It didn't matter if Germany had better tanks. It didn't matter if their soldiers were braver or more disciplined. You cannot fight a war when the enemy can build a logistics hub in your backyard faster than you can retreat. He turned to the young corporal who had marked the Americans on day 1. The boy looked old now. His face was dirty, his eyes hollow. "Sir," the corporal asked, "how do we fight this?" The major looked at the endless line of trucks still pouring into the base, bringing more fuel, more bombs, more men. "You don't," he replied softly. "You don't fight a glacier. You just get out of the way or you get crushed." This airfield wasn't unique. That is the final, crushing truth of this story. While the Germans watched this miracle in the mud, the exact same thing was happening at 5 other sites across France. And then 10, and then 20. The Americans were unrolling these steel carpets all the way to the Rhine. They were paving their way to victory, one perforated steel sheet at a time. As the weeks went on, the prisoners were moved to the rear, away from the front. But the image of that airfield stayed with them. Years later, after the war, many of those German soldiers wrote memoirs or spoke to historians. They didn't talk much about the battles. They didn't talk about the strategy. They talked about the stuff, the sheer, overwhelming amount of stuff the Americans had. They talked about the chocolate bars. They talked about the endless gasoline. But mostly, they talked about the speed with which the Americans could alter the face of the earth. We often romanticize World War II. We think of it as a clash of warriors, of aces and generals. But at its core, it was a war of production. It was a war of logistics. It was won not just by the soldier with the rifle, but by the engineer with the slide rule and the operator with the bulldozer. That muddy field in France is long gone now. The steel mats were pulled up and sold for scrap, or reused by local farmers to make fences. The grass has grown back. If you stood there today, you would see nothing but a quiet pasture. You wouldn't know that once, in 1944, the ground shook with the weight of a superpower waking up. You wouldn't know that on this spot, the concept of blitzkrieg lightning war was stolen from its inventors and turned against them. The Germans invented the idea of moving fast, but the Americans perfected the art of building fast. The legacy of those 10 days is not just a footnote in history books. It changed how the world understood power. Before this, power was defined by how many men you could march. After this, power was defined by how quickly you could project force. The modern concept of the forward operating base, the idea that you can drop a city anywhere in the world in 48 hours, started right here, in the mud with a roll of steel matting and a refuse-to-lose attitude. So the next time you see a construction crew working on a highway at night, under the glare of those floodlights, think of those men in 1944. Think of the rain, the mud, and the impossible deadline. And remember the German major standing at the fence, watching his world dismantle, not with a bang, but with the clatter of steel planks and the roar of a diesel engine. He learned the hardest lesson of the 20th century. Amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics, and the side that can build the runway in 10 days is the side that gets to decide how the history books are written. While the German major was being marched to the rear, accepting the inevitability of his nation's defeat, the story on the airfield itself was far from over. In fact, for the young American pilots who had to call this patch of steel and mud home, the nightmare was just beginning. We have talked about the engineering triumph, but we haven't talked about the human cost of operating from a runway that was built in a week. You have to understand what it feels like to land a 7-ton fighter plane on wet steel. A paved runway has texture, it grips the rubber tires. Steel does not. When the morning dew settled on those perforated planks, or when the French rain returned, that runway became as slick as a sheet of ice. Pilots called it skating. You would touch down at 100 miles an hour, tap the brakes, and feel the plane shudder. If you braked too hard, the wheels would lock, the tires would lose traction on the smooth metal, and the plane would start to slide sideways. It was a terrifying, slow-motion drift. If the landing gear caught one of the millions of holes in the planking at the wrong angle, the strut would snap like a dry twig, the propeller would strike the steel with a scream of tearing metal, and the plane would cartwheel into the mud. The edges of the runway were littered with the carcasses of P-47 seconds that didn't make it. They were pushed into the ditches by bulldozers, unceremonious graves for million-dollar machines, so the next guy could land. This was the brutal calculus of the forward airbase. Efficiency trumped safety. The mission came first. But this story of rapid construction wasn't contained to the fields of France. While the Germans were staring in shock at the logistics in Europe half a world away, in the Pacific, this same technology was being pushed to its absolute breaking point. And this is where the scale of American industrial power becomes truly frightening. In the Pacific, there were no farm fields to level. There were only coral atolls, volcanic rocks, and jungles so dense they swallowed light. The engineers there, the famous Seabees, faced challenges that made the French mud look like a playground. They were building airfields on islands that hadn't existed on maps 10 years prior. Imagine the scene on Saipan or Iwo Jima. The fighting is still going on. Marines are clearing caves with flamethrowers just a few hundred yards away, and right behind them, the bulldozers are already running. In the Pacific, they didn't just lay the Marston mats over mud, they laid them over crushed coral. The dust was so fine it ground engines to pieces. The heat was so intense you could fry an egg on the steel planks. Yet, the result was the same. The Japanese defenders, much like the German major, were baffled. They would shell an airfield at night, blowing craters in the runway, convinced they had disabled the American air power for weeks. But the American system was modular. You didn't need to repave the hole. You just ran out with a jeep, tossed the damaged steel planks into the ocean, and clicked new ones into place. By dawn, the runway was whole again. This psychological warfare, the ability to heat infrastructure faster than the enemy could destroy it, broke the will of the Japanese commanders, just as it had the Germans. One captured Japanese diary read simply, "The Americans are insects. They build nests overnight. We destroy them, and they are back in the morning. It is hopeless." But what happened to all this steel when the guns finally fell silent? This is perhaps the most fascinating and overlooked chapter of the story. The war ended. The troops went home. The planes were scrapped or sold, but the mats remained. There were millions of tons of steel planking scattered across the globe. From the jungles of the Philippines to the forests of Bavaria, the US military didn't want to pay to ship it all back to Pittsburgh, so they left it. And in doing so, they inadvertently rebuilt the world they had just conquered. If you traveled through Europe in the late 1940s and 50s, you would see Marston Matting everywhere. Farmers used the planks to build fences for their cattle. The holes were perfect for stringing wire. They used them to patch holes in barn roofs. They welded them together to build makeshift bridges over creeks. In the Pacific, the legacy was even more visible. Entire villages in the Philippines and Papua New Guinea were constructed using leftover airfield mats. They became walls for houses, pig pens, and even guardrails on dangerous mountain roads. The steel that was designed to launch bombers to destroy cities ended up becoming the literal foundation of the recovery. There's a famous photo from the 1950s of a bridge in a small town in Korea. The bridge deck is entirely made of rusted, interlocking steel planks. Thousands of people walked over it every day, likely never knowing that they were walking on the remnants of a runway that once launched airstrikes against the Axis powers. It is a poetic irony. The tools of war became the infrastructure of peace. However, the military legacy of that 10-day miracle in France is what defines our world today. The success of those engineers changed the American military doctrine forever. The Pentagon realized that you don't need to conquer a city to have a base. You just need a flat piece of dirt and enough C-130 cargo planes to carry the equipment. This concept evolved. In Vietnam, they built fire bases on mountaintops using helicopters to drop in the bulldozers. In the Cold War, they planned rapid deployment strips in West Germany, ready to receive reinforcements in hours. And in the modern era, looking at conflicts in the Middle East, we see the direct descendants of those 1944 engineers building vast, city-sized bases in the middle of the desert in a matter of weeks. The German major we met at the beginning of our story saw the end of the old world. He saw the death of the fortress mentality. He witnessed the birth of the expeditionary mindset. He realized that static defenses like the Maginot Line or the Atlantic Wall were useless against an enemy that brought their own roads, their own bridges, and their own airports with them. We often talk about the atomic bomb as the technology that defined the post-war era. It provided the ultimate threat, but it was the humble, perforated steel plank and the yellow bulldozer that provided the ultimate capability. The bomb promised destruction, but logistics promised presence. And in the game of geopolitics, being there on the ground, fully supplied, with air support, in 10 days flat is the ultimate power. So, as we look back on that rainy week in France, remember that it wasn't just a construction project, it was a revolution. It was the moment the United States proved that it could export its industrial might to any coordinate on the map. The mud has dried. The steel has rusted away or been repurposed. The roar of the P-47 seconds has faded into history. But the lesson remains. In the end, the war wasn't won by the flashing bayonet or the daring charge. It was won by the grunt with the shovel, the operator in the cab, and the absolute, unwavering refusal to let a little thing like an impossible swamp stand in the way of victory.